Hello and welcome to today's webinar on water and climate change. To give you kind of an introduction, my name is Elizabeth Chasen, and I am a senior fellow with the Climate Leaders Fellowship, which is a fellowship powered by the Stanford Deliberative Democracy Lab, as well as Rustic Pathways and the Rustic Pathways Foundation. As a senior fellow, the Climate Leaders Fellowship helps fellows work on and enact a project relating to either a activism or educational campaign or some sort of other campaign in order to raise awareness for the impact that climate change has on environments and communities. So today's webinar is going to cover three kind of main portions. The first portion that we're going to talk about is what is climate change in order to kind of define what climate change is before we look at the ways that specifically climate change impacts water resources. We're also going to move into the bulk of the presentation, which will be the impact of climate change on water resources and society. And we'll look at ways including inundation and flooding, water scarcity, as well as the different communities and groups of people or areas that are specifically susceptible or vulnerable to climate change. And then we'll end out the presentation by looking at the specific things that we, both as individuals and as a kind of collective humanity or society, can do to mitigate the impacts of climate change and also act on impacts of climate change within our own local communities. So I think in order to have a stable foundation for the rest of this presentation, we need to start out by defining what is climate change. So take a moment to think about what is your initial understanding of climate change, and just take a moment to reflect, and then we'll move on in a couple of seconds. All right, so I hope you had a moment to reflect and kind of just establish your baseline for how much you understand about climate change, how you would define it, what experiences you have with the issue, and just kind of what feelings you have towards it. So, to give you kind of a textbook definition, the United Nations defines climate change as referring to the long term shifts in temperature and weather patterns that we see within our own environments. Such shifts can be natural due to changes in the sun's activity or large volcanic eruptions, but we have seen since the 1800s where we started seeing kind of an influence of urbanization and the Industrial Revolution, especially within the United States. Human activities have been the main driver for climate change, primarily due to the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, which contribute to greenhouse gases and global warming overall. So, like I said, I just mentioned global warming, and that's kind of how I mainly like to think about the impacts of climate change, especially whenever we're looking at the influences that climate change has on water resources. Because climate change is mainly seen in communities as the kind of the warming of temperatures overall, which has a significant impact on the water resources that are available in environments. So whenever I was researching this presentation, I had the privilege of emailing briefly with Dr. J.L. Banner, who is a professor at the University of Texas at Austin and will be teaching at Baylor University in environmental science in 2025. And he gave me the ability and permission to share a lecture that he did, I believe this year or a couple of years ago, on the impact that climate change has on water resources and climate in Texas, specifically in the 21st century. So I'd like to share a portion of this lecture that he allowed me to share with y'all, because I think the definition that he provides for what kind of climate change is and how it manifests within communities is a really succinct and inclusive way to describe it.
But I think it's often important when we hear rhetoric, debate, uncertainty, skepticism about climate change to step back and look at this consensus of the larger community and the set of experts that are there. I think it's a really important way to sort of come back and ground ourselves in these discussions. All right, so firstly, if the atmosphere warms, there'll be more evaporation of the oceans because the oceans will warm up, they'll evaporate. That'll put more water vapor into the atmosphere, and all other things being equal, that will lead to more intense rain events. Secondly, if we have a warmer atmosphere, that will cause more evaporation over land, and that will lead to longer and more intense droughts. And then thirdly here, with a warmer atmosphere, the temperature at the surface of the ocean will increase, and these sea surface temperatures, if you will, they're kind of a metric of how much fuel there is in the engine room for hurricanes and tropical storms. So the higher the sea surface temperature, the more intense hurricanes we can expect. All right. So a bottom line here for me is that all of these predictions I've talked about are all grounded in principles of physics and chemistry that no one argues about. Another thing I think that's important to step back and take stock of when we hear about rhetoric or controversy about climate change.
So, like Dr. Banner talked about, there has been some debate within the scientific and just kind of general community over to what extent humans are actually impacting the progression of climate change over time. And regardless of your feelings or your beliefs towards the issue of climate change, we have seen increases of, like Dr. Banner said, these established kind of scientific principles that seem to be increasing in correlation with human activity as we look at the impacts of climate change over time, regardless of kind of the cause that you believe to be most descriptive of the impact of climate change. So these 3 points that Dr. Banner outlined will be kind of the guiding outline for the presentation that you're going to be seeing today. So, based on this initial definition, take a moment kind of within yourself to reflect, how has your understanding of climate change shifted or remained the same? Based on kind of what you know about now in relation to the initial reflection that you did. And also, how have you witnessed the impacts of climate change in your own community, whether it's different weather phenomena or different just conditions within your environment that you've seen, or different ways that you've been engaged within activism for the climate crisis. Just kind of, how has climate change impacted you on a local level? So take a moment to reflect, and then we'll move on in a couple of seconds. All right. So, whenever we look into the specific topic of today's webinar, which is the ways in which the climate crisis and climate change impacts water resources, why is it important to consider water resources when examining and looking for ways to manage the impact of climate change? And I'm sure you've heard the statistic that 70 to 71% of Earth's surface is covered in water. And this is an extremely kind of staggering statistic when you consider the fact that a lot of climate change activism and climate change awareness campaigns focus on the impact that climate change has on land-based communities. So I think it's very important to consider the impact that climate change has on water resources and water overall on the earth whenever we're looking at the ways in which climate change is going to continue impacting our communities into the future. So let's move into kind of the bulk portion of the presentation, which is section 2, the impact of climate change on water resources and society. So the first impact that we're going to look at is inundation and flooding. So this is directly connected to that first point that Dr. Banner outlined, which is, as we see more evaporation over oceans, we're going to see more water vapor in the atmosphere, leading to more intense rain events. And so as we see more intense rain events and more water vapor in the atmosphere, we're going to see an influx of flooding events and inundation overall, especially in coastal areas. So to give you kind of a definition of inundation and flooding, think of flooding as a temporary phenomena, whether it's a natural disaster or maybe even a seasonal phenomena. It is when dry areas become temporarily wet due to an influx of water to the location. As for inundation, is a more permanent thing. We see this whenever we're considering the terms like sea level rise, because it's when dry areas are permanently submerged in water as a result of changes in water level over time. So inundation is going to be particularly important when we're talking about the impacts of climate change, because it is going to be the main kind of effect that we see long term of the impacts of climate change and kind of distinct increases in flooding that lead to more permanent inundation. And if you're at all confused with the differences between these terms, that's perfectly understandable and is actually an ongoing debate within kind of the scientific community as to how to define the difference between these two terms when we're talking about the impact that climate change has on water resources, especially when we're talking about mean sea level rise and the ways that this impacts coastal communities. So this kind of highlights a need for more research into this area as we're looking at the impacts of climate change. So when we look at this graph from NASA, we see the kind of increasing trend of satellite data from 1993 to the present. When we're looking at sea level rise since 1993, we see an increase of 102.4 millimeters, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when we're considering sea level rise, it is a little bit. It is more significant than we think. So, inundation, like I said, is the permanent submerging of dry areas with water over time. So, this is directly connected because sea level rise increases that are a result of the inundation of that result in the inundation of coastal areas are primarily caused by the added water from both melting ice sheets and glaciers, and also the expansion of water as it warms, which are both contributing from the impact that global warming has on the water resources within our environments. So, as we're seeing an increase in global warming, we're also seeing an increase in sea level rise that is resulting in the inundation of these coastal communities. To give you kind of a global example of inundation and flooding and the ways that they're impacting environments due to increases in global warming and climate change, we can look at the kind of a case study example in Bangkok, Thailand, which is one of the areas most susceptible or at risk to the influences of inundation and flooding due to climate change. And some contributing factors that are in this area to the impact that inundation and flooding has as climate change is increasing their prevalence is Bangkok is already at a low elevation, making it more susceptible to sea level rise. It is also experiencing gradual subsidence or kind of sinking, lowering in elevation due to excessive groundwater pumping of the reservoir beneath. A Bangkok clay layer, as it's called, which kind of makes the environment of Bangkok more susceptible to sea level rise and subsidence. We also see torrential rains, like we talked about at the beginning of Dr. Banner's video. As we see more evaporation, we're going to see more torrential rains leading to flooding, worsening, even if it's kind of in line with seasonal flooding, it's going to be of a greater severity. We also see over time as infrastructure is kind of aging and also unable to keep up with these increasing severity of torrential rains, we see poor drainage systems and infrastructure that are worsening the impacts of inundation and flooding. And as we can look at this map that shows the impact of coastal flooding projections for the year 2100, we can see that the worsening of inundation and flooding due to climate change can lead to impacts such as population displacement and infrastructure losses, as well as economic disruptions, as the economic situation and kind of society in Bangkok is no longer able to function as it would in the present once these impacts of climate change are seen in a more permanent sense. To give you a more kind of regional example for the Texas area, we see a lot of the impacts of inundation and flooding due to climate change on the Texas coast. So if you look at this map, we see sea level rise most primarily within the Houston or Galveston area. And some contributing factors, you'll see a lot of parallels between this and the example from Bangkok. We see an already low elevation that makes coastal areas susceptible to sea level rise, gradual subsidence or sinking due to groundwater withdrawal, but also oil and gas extraction can be a contributing factor. And we also see the compaction of surface sediments that worsen the sea level rise. And like in Bangkok, we see worsening coastal storms and rainfall due to climate change that are increasing the sea level rise. So, to give you some kind of specific examples of the impacts that it has on a local sense, at least for my area, we see, like in Bangkok, population displacement and infrastructure losses. More specifically, about 20% of the Texas population lives in highly vulnerable, low-lying coastal communities, showing that a lot of the population is going to be impacted by the sea level rise that is affecting coastal communities. We also see economic disruptions, whether or not that's excuse me, whether or not that's for agriculture or other industries. And we also see the destruction of natural environments and habitats, especially on the coast. There's a lot of important wildlife habitats and ecosystems. And so as the sea level rises, we see the destruction and kind of influence that climate change has on, in addition to kind of urban and human settlements, but also natural environments. So, as we've looked at two examples, kind of a regional specific example and also a more globally minded example, we can see that sea level rise, inundation, and flooding that are worsening as a result of the climate crisis and climate change with global warming, we can see that it truly is a global problem. And as you can see on this map, that shows the impact of sea level rise by 2100 and the number of people per country. Per area of land or per region that are expected to be under sea level by the year 2100. We can see from this projection that it is truly a very complicated transnational issue that requires a very transnational solution because as we can see that there are a significant number of people in like the East Asia and Asia area, largely due to population densities and also kind of the influences of coastal areas like we talked about with Bangkok. But we can see that there's also areas of the United States and also areas in South America that are going to be impacted over time by rising sea levels. And it's really important to kind of get on top of this issue and understand it as well as possible before we see such kind of drastic transnational impacts on people across the world. To move on to the second way that climate change is impacting water resources, both in Texas and globally, we can look at the issue of water scarcity. So this connects back to Dr. Banner's second point. As we see more evaporation over land due to global warming and climate change, we're going to see longer, more intense periods of drought. So if you live in Texas like me, you're probably alarmingly used to kind of the influence that drought has on your life. It's become almost a normal accepted phenomena. But as we see the impacts of climate change over time, these periods of drought are going to worsen, lengthen, and become more intense. So, to give you kind of another definition, water scarcity is considered a relative term because it is dependent upon the amount of people within an area as well as the amount of water that is accessible within an area. It is defined as the condition of when the supply of usable, clean water that is accessible is not able to meet the demands of a population. And usually, when we're talking about clean, accessible water, that usually means potable water, so not kind of salt water or ocean water. And that is able to kind of meet the necessary demands of a society to function, whether for drinking water or other industries. And we see that water scarcity is worsening due to the increasing water demand that is present as populations grow and become more concentrated, diminishing terrestrial water stores, failing infrastructure, and a lack of water monitoring systems. Because as water is being used up, particularly groundwater, a lack of monitoring can cause the irresponsible use of such water stores, worsening water scarcity that is already prevalent. So, to look at another case study on a more kind of global level, we can see that South Asia is one of the areas most affected by water scarcity, particularly in this map. We see the impact that water scarcity has on areas like Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. In India, for example, in 2019, 600 million people face high to extreme water scarcity. In Pakistan, currently only about 20% of the population has access to safe drinking water. And factors like pollution worsen water scarcity. So we can see the kind of interconnection between issues like the climate crisis and other environmental issues as they all kind of work together to make the climate crisis such a prevalent issue. So in South Asia, as global warming and population increases are present, we see that water scarcity is expected to continue increasing over time, making the impacts that such issues have on this area in South Asia extremely prevalent and a issue that needs to be addressed before it worsens and continues impacting the very high population of the area. So, a lot of the reasoning behind such issues with water scarcity, particularly in South Asia, is the dependence of the area on the Indus River Basin for water supplies. So, we can see that the Indus River Basin is an integral water source for both India and Pakistan. And the Indus River Basin is supplied by glaciers that are disappearing due to global warming. So, as we see these glaciers starting to melt and disappear, we see the water available decrease and the salinization of water worsen as kind of seawater is being introduced into the equation. We also see less predictable weather patterns due to climate change that cause more prolonged droughts, worsening water scarcity in the area, like we talked about both in Texas and globally, as we see increased evaporation. So, another case study that we can kind of look at in Texas, in the United States specifically, is the influence of water scarcity on the already existing wet dry boundary that exists on the 100th meridian within the United States. So, if you've ever looked at a satellite image of the United States, you can see that along this line that I'm outlining here, there's a kind of a distinct difference between the more kind of green, lush right side of the image and the more rocky, kind of arid, not necessarily severely arid, but relatively drier left side of the image. So this is called the wet dry boundary of the US along the 100th meridian. And it is the 100th meridian, like I mentioned, is the line of longitude that is used to separate the humid eastern United States from the dry western plains. And since this is kind of an established climate boundary between the areas of the United States, it has kind of demonstrated how the climate of an area can impact the way of life for people in different areas and impact different areas at a not necessarily even amount. So here's an interesting quote from Walter Prescott Webb that is, "The primary unity of the West is the shortage of water." So we can see how areas like the Western United States have been already impacted by water scarcity and have had to adapt their way of life in order to kind of make do with the environment. So as we can see the impacts of climate change increasing water scarcity, we can see that such adaptations are going to be necessary in areas that are increasing in size and increasing in the prevalence of such areas, regardless of the existing climate that is present right now.
Here.
So before we get into the video on the next slide, there is actually something interesting that is happening with the 100th meridian. Specifically, we'll look at an example of how this is happening within Texas. And I would like to show a video from Dr. Banner as well, where he does a very nice job of explaining what's happening with the 100th meridian in Texas.
Here. So let's focus in on Texas now. Here's another satellite image, the end of August in the year 2010. And this satellite image, you can see where that wet dry boundary, the 100th meridian is. The 100th meridian actually defines the eastern edge of the panhandle of Texas, and it comes right down. That's actually a pretty good demarcator of the wet dry boundary, wouldn't you say? All right, so here we are, the end of August 2010. We're going to roll the clock forward 365 days, go to the same date, end of August 2011. I heard a I heard an audible gasp, because this was actually quite dramatic, right? This was a really remarkable change in our landscape. It caused a lot of economic loss that I'll talk about later, having to do with livestock, agriculture. It was a loss, according to a study at Texas A&M University, of 301 million trees. 10% of all trees in the state were lost in this, what's called the drought of 2011. It only lasted a few years, so it was a short-lived drought, but it was the most intense drought in the instrumental record in the history of keeping records of Texas, the most intense drought there was. This may be a harbinger of things to come. This may be what we're looking at, but not just for 3 years, but for a much longer period of time later this century. So that's where we're going with this. So this term, the 100th meridian, where did it come from? Let's go back in time a little bit. From a very prescient person. The term was coined by one John Wesley Powell. Powell was a professor of geology at Illinois Wesleyan University, and if you went to see him during his office hours, you probably wouldn't find him there, because most of the time he was out exploring the American West. He was a hydrologist, a geoscientist. He had very prescient views and noticed how dry the western US was, and that how it could probably not support extensive development of the landscape out there. And he warned, and he issued warnings to whoever would listen, but including Congress, through statements such as this: "Gentlemen, you're piling up a heritage of conflict over water rights because there's just not enough water to supply the land." So here, Powell is saying, heed this advice, don't develop these lands to the west of the 100th meridian, because there's just not enough water to do that. Well, as we know, that wasn't the case, as what happened today. And one big reason was that the big railroad companies took issue with Powell's view, disagreed with his view because they had a vested interest. Right? The railroad companies wanted to see these lands be developed because it would make the railways all that more valuable. They lobbied Congress aggressively and successfully, and we know the outcome of that. Right? Unfortunately, Powell's advice was not listened to. Powell, in addition to being so prescient, led a really very interesting life. He was the second director of the U.S. Geological Survey. He was the founder and first director of the U.S. Bureau of Ethnology. He was an officer in the Civil War. And in the Battle of Shiloh, as an officer, he was giving his orders to his troops to charge, and he took on musket fire and wound up being wounded and lost his right arm, as you can see here. So he went out for a few months, healed up, and get this, he re-ups his service. He's back in the Civil War, and there he is in the siege of Vicksburg, one-armed with his troops, hunkered down in the trenches to avoid the musket fire. And like any good geoscientist, he starts studying the strata on the walls of the trenches and writing reports about it. Okay, enough with my somewhat mild obsession for John Wesley Powell. Let's move on. That was back then. This is now. In a proposal to the National Science Foundation, we posed the question, the new 100th meridian. In other words, what will happen if this wet-dry boundary will shift to the east? Look what's lying in wait for it in that red corridor. In gray are counties with greater than 50% population growth from 2010 to 2050. The state's population will double in that time, and what the demographers tell us is that almost all of these new Texans will move into existing cities and expand them outward. So if that happens, twice as many people, the demand for water goes way up, that wet-dry boundary shifts, the available water, due to extended droughts coming to this region, the available water goes way down. I'll pose the question for the first time here and repeat it later. Is this a recipe for a resilient Texas?
So to kind of provide a relatively immediate answer to Dr. Benner's question that he just posed, we see that with the impact of climate change and global warming, and also the increasing in water scarcity as we see the impacts of these factors, if the 100th meridian is to continue shifting to the east and coming in contact with these larger cities within Texas, we can see that water scarcity is bound to continue worsening and make kind of Texas, as it functions currently, not a kind of feasible system of working in the future. Because like we talked about, as populations increase and water supplies decrease, we see increasing water scarcity, worsening the pressure that this puts on the functioning of societies, cities, communities, and also individuals as they're forced out of locations, or their life within certain locations becomes more difficult. So like we looked at kind of with a global map of inundation and flooding as a result of climate change and global warming impacting water resources, we see that water stress and water scarcity is another global problem that requires transnational and global solutions. So we can see that projections for water stress by country in the year 2040. We see a lot of water scarcity and stress, like we talked about with the example in South Asia. We see a lot of stress in kind of Asia, the Middle East, East Asia, but also some in Northern Africa, and also within the United States. So we can see that this is a very wide-reaching and complex global issue that really needs to be addressed in order to mitigate the impact that climate change and global warming will have on water resources and eventually communities as we look into the future. So whenever we're looking at, like we looked at on the map on the previous slide, since global warming and climate change impact water resources in such complex ways and varying ways across the globe, we must consider the influence that environmental inequality has on the impacts of climate change. So environmental inequality refers to the varying ways and differing ways that such impacts of climate change are impacting populations. So some populations are going to be impacted more, some populations are going to be impacting less, and we must also consider the societal factors that influence such differing levels of impact. So, to kind of bring in Dr. Banner's third point of high sea level surface temperatures causing more intense tropical storms and hurricanes, this provides us a very nice segue into the issues of environmental inequality. Because I feel like it would be remiss to talk about climate change causing more intense tropical storms and hurricanes without looking at the example of Hurricane Katrina within the United States. So, although Hurricane Katrina cannot be blamed in severity entirely on climate change. There have been theories that the severity of the hurricane was in part due to the influences that climate change has on water resources and ocean resources. So, whenever we're looking at the issue of environmental inequality, Hurricane Katrina provides a very valuable case study in the differing impact that climate change and the natural disasters that are worsening due to climate change have on populations. So, as we look at these maps, we can see that some of the areas most impacted by the negative impacts of Hurricane Katrina were areas of increased poverty in New Orleans and also areas, communities of color within New Orleans. So we can see that low income and also minority communities can be disproportionately impacted by especially natural disasters due to the resources that are available to these communities. And as natural disasters worsen due to climate change, we see increasing impacts on such communities. Which, like I've used the term environmental discrimination, but it's also been dubbed environmental racism or various other terms. But traditionally, the term applies to the disproportionate exposure of low income and minority communities to environmental pollutants. And we see this especially whenever minority communities or low income communities are only able to afford housing or land in areas that are influenced by industrial waste or other pollutants. But we can also see the expansion of this term whenever we look at the impacts of climate change, because we see that the worst impacts of climate change are often most severe in environments where low income or minority communities are forced to settle, whether it's due to cheaper housing or other factors. Regardless, environmental discrimination is a very important topic that we must consider when looking at ways to address the impacts of climate change, because it brings in the topic of environmental justice. And when we're looking at ways to achieve environmental justice for various communities and also environments, we need to consider addressing and finding solutions for the climate crisis that are able to benefit members of society from all levels, whether that's low income communities or minority communities that are disproportionately affected, or other communities that are affected, but maybe not to the same degree. So, if we're able to find solutions that are able to address all aspects and levels of society, we'll be able to find more sustainable ways to function in a society impacted by climate change and find ways to mitigate the effects for all areas of society. All right. So, whenever we think about environmental discrimination or environmental racism, however you would like to call it or refer to it, we must look at the population of migrants that are impacted by the influence of climate change and also the increase in migration that is prevalent as climate change is impacting different areas. So we look at, like we talked about previously, the influence of inundation and flooding that is forcing people out of coastal areas, or water scarcity that is pressuring people to leave their communities in search of increased water resources or a more stable life in that sense. We can see that there's a distinct connection between climate change and migration. And to talk more about this connection and the factors that are influencing both climate change and migration, I have a video from Michael Chasen with the American Red Cross, who is deeply involved with the impact that climate change has on migration.
Good afternoon. This is Mike Chasen with the American Red Cross. Talk to you a little bit about climate change and disasters and migration and some of our response initiatives therein. The American Red Cross has been responding to disasters for over 140 years. And, I can tell you that in recent years, like 2023 alone, we experienced an all-time high of $28 billion plus disasters that ravaged communities and forced hundreds of thousands of people to flee from severe storms, floods, and wildfire. Unfortunately, climate crisis has taken a heavier toll on frontline communities already dealing with other chronic social issues due to relentless climate disasters, low-income families, older adults, people with disabilities often experience heightened challenge with chronic health conditions, food insecurity, and the lack of affordable housing. Um, Internationally, I can tell you that many countries face significant and urgent risk from extreme weather, but don't have the resources to ensure communities are prepared. Uh, in 2022 alone, people were displaced 32.6 million times globally by climate driven disasters, including floods, droughts, storms, heat waves, tropical cyclones, and wildfires. Uh, Red Crossers are supporting families across the globe struggling to cope with more frequent and intense disasters year after year. Without concerted action, twice as many people across the globe are predicted to need humanitarian support by 2050 due to climate driven disasters. Speaking to some of our activities in other countries, our efforts have initially focused on Bangladesh, Colombia, East Timor, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Indonesia, Nepal, Philippines, and Solomon Islands. As part of the world's largest humanitarian network, uh, sorry, as part of the world's largest humanitarian network, American Red Cross works in collaboration with other national societies in partner countries, as well as the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies and the Climate Center. In urban areas, we work directly with community-led coalitions to help develop heat action plans to help those at highest risk. We also support local organizations to bolster community preparedness and response mechanisms, especially in coastal areas. Just to give you a couple of facts around the climate crisis, in the last 10 years, we've seen a 70% increase in billion-dollar disasters. In the last 10 years, 8.5 million people were forced from their homes. And in the past 5 years, we've had more Category 4 and 5 hurricanes have made landfall than in the previous 50 years combined. Nearly twice as many disaster relief operations for major disasters are launched now compared to a decade ago. When we look at the effects of climate and disaster impacting migration, so far, climate-related cross-border migration has occurred on a smaller scale than internal movements. Now, will that change with additional extreme weather events? Most likely. Currently, the most dangerous land navigation route is the Darien Gap through Central America, or the Mediterranean via sea. So, it's certainly a concern, and certainly efforts to mitigate that with populations that are impacted. It's a bit of a double-edged sword when you have a population that's already vulnerable, and then they're impacted by these large-scale disasters and effects of climate change, which amplify their wanting to get to evacuate or to end up in a better situation. So a lot to think about right now. Overall, the climate change impacting migration has not been as much as we would certainly anticipate 20, 25 years from now. But now is the time to implement mitigation measures that will hopefully help vulnerable populations.
So, as was discussed in that video, it becomes very clear as we look at the kind of worsening impacts of climate change on all aspects of society. We can see that the climate crisis and the migration crisis are two kind of twin crises that mitigation efforts for climate change and global warming could help kind of mitigate the issues that are associated with the worsening vulnerability of migrant groups, and also the impacts that climate change has on water resources and communities across the globe. So, whenever we're considering ways to address climate change, it's important to consider the impacts that climate change has on all aspects of society, from migration to environmental concerns to societal issues to economic issues and various other aspects of society. So, to kind of end off this presentation, it's important to consider what we can do as a society and as individuals in order to address the issues that we've talked about thus far in the presentation, as we look at the increasing impact that climate change and global warming has on water resources and the implications that this has. Because I feel like it would be a little bit of a depressing presentation if I was just like, well, that's the situation. So there's always something that we can do as individuals and as communities in order to rather raise awareness for the issue or help with mitigation efforts. So before we start off, I'd like to give you a moment to kind of set a baseline for yourself and reflect upon the question, do you think that one person can make a difference when it comes to addressing climate change and its impact? So I'll give you a moment to kind of reflect within yourself on this question, and then we'll move on in a couple of seconds. All right, so I hope you've kind of come up with an answer for yourself with this question. And before I kind of share my personal philosophy with regards to this question, I think we should look at some of the more accepted ways that both individuals and communities can have an impact on the mitigating and raising awareness for the climate crisis and the impacts that climate change and global warming have on water resources. So the first way that we can think about kind of a more community or kind of we as humanity can impact the climate crisis and mitigation efforts is through sustainable planning for communities.
The urban
So we'll go back to the video that I just briefly showed. So one thing that Dr. Banner emphasized within his lecture is the role that sustainable planning for urban environments has on limiting the impacts that worsening climate change has for societies. So one phenomenon that he talked about is the urban heat island effect, which has been seen to worsen the impacts of climate change. So as we see worsening impacts of climate change in societies, there are steps that can be taken with regards to sustainable planning that can limit the devastation that this can cause for societies. So I will play the video on the next slide, and we'll go into that a little bit more in more detail.
The urban heat island effect. Let's talk about this. So in urban environments, we have impervious cover. That's rooftops, that's roadways, it's sidewalks, it's asphalt, it's concrete, it's the metal of vehicles. All of these things, impervious cover, have the ability, the thermodynamic ability to absorb radiation coming in from the sun and then re-radiating it as heat energy to the environment that surrounds us at a higher level than it would be otherwise if we had a natural landscape. So it artificially warms the area we are in if we are in a city. That's the urban heat island effect. What I'd like to do is consider the magnitude of this effect. So for this environmental justice class, this field class, my students mapped the heat using infrared photography. And I'm going to show you this scene here from Walmart in Northeast Austin. I'm going to show you it mapped out in terms of heat. And I pose the question to you, where do you think will be the hottest part of the scene we're looking at here? The black car? The parking lot? Anything else? Who says the trees? It's always the tree's fault, right? No? The white car. Oh, interesting. So the white car, the black car, the parking lot. Okay. Next question before the big reveal. What will be the range of temperatures that we see? You don't have to tell me the specific temperatures, but what's the total range of temperatures? 10, 20, 30. Going once, going twice. All right, are you ready? Here we go. All right, so if you said the parking lot, you were uniformly the most correct. Some of the cars are actually as hot. Interestingly, look at this white car. It's actually, so sorry, The purples are cooler, and the hot yellow, white yellow is the hottest. All right, look at that. Look at the white car over here. It's actually cooler than the other cars. So this is one mitigation effect that's been proposed. Let's paint buildings and roads and cities white, right? Because they're reflecting the radiation instead of absorbing and re-radiating it. So you've actually come up with a mitigation strategy in making that guess. Okay, now look at the temperature range. I'll tell you that day, the ambient temperature was 90 degrees. So look at that range. It's 45 degrees range of temperature. Above ambient of 90, so what that's 30, 32, call it 30 degrees above what we would normally have if there was a natural landscape there. So now I want you to consider this. Combine that increase with the number of 100-degree days we said we may have in the future model projections. So consider we'll have 4 months a year where it's 100 degrees. Now you have to add to that 30 degrees if you're standing on that surface. Now imagine you're working construction, roofing, or as a first responder, and you're wearing tens of pounds of protective gear. Imagine what that will be like. I'll ask you another question in terms of imagining what it will be like. Maybe you don't have one of those jobs. What do you see yourself doing in this world? Right then, so that's a problem with our cities. How can we reimagine this? So impervious cover impacts, there are many negative impacts in cities of impervious cover. One is what we just talked about, the heat island effect. The other is water quality and water quantity, right? Impervious cover will degrade water quality dramatically. Anyone interested in how we've done this in Austin would be delighted to talk to you about it. Now what I'm going to look at here is that we have a really great opportunity in terms of brand new buildings. How many of them have design elements taking into account mitigating the urban heat island effect? Why is this a great opportunity? Well, if there's going to be twice as many Texans by 2050, we're going to be building a lot of new neighborhoods, communities, municipalities, and to institute these kinds of things is relatively straightforward and relatively inexpensive. If we try to retrofit cities to some of these changes, yeah, that's going to be more expensive and it should still be done. But the great opportunity here is we're growing so fast, we could get out in front of this and make design changes now before anything is built. It's really easy to make design changes at the blueprint stage. So let me give you an example of this in Austin. So I've been, again, moderately obsessed with observing new buildings in Austin. And every week, I know when I drive back Thursday afternoon, there's going to be 5 new buildings that weren't there when I left on Monday afternoon. And here we are in central Austin. And I look at this building, and check this out. You go past Jackson Avenue here on Bull Creek Road, and look at this little inlet here, this driveway. The curb is right here. The wall of the building is here. The building's still being constructed. But I stuck in there behind the construction fence. I could just about, with my wingspan, touch the curb, touch the building. What that metric tells me is that when this building is done, it will be very close to 100% impervious cover. What an opportunity we have to do things differently than this. All right, so this is just one example. Everywhere I've been in Austin and actually beyond, this is the norm. Anything else is a very rare exception to this. But this could be the norm. That's the great opportunity that we have if we get out in front of it.
So, like Dr. Banner talked about, whenever we look at the increasing population growth that we're seeing both in Texas and across the globe, while, especially like we talked about with water scarcity, while population growth can exacerbate a lot of the impacts that climate change has on water resources and various other environmental impacts, the population growth that we're seeing as we kind of look into the future is also, it presents a distinct opportunity to make changes with regards to urban planning, architecture, various environmental kind of elements that are incorporated into city planning in order to help minimize the impact that climate change has on both societies, water resources, the environment, and the ways that it impacts people's lives more directly. So while it may seem like societies, it's an insurmountable task in order to kind of retrofit societies as they are currently, in order to be more sustainable and limit the impact that climate change is going to have in the future. We can see that the population growth that is going to be associated with the future presents a very hopeful opportunity to enact these changes in a low cost and effective and efficient way. So whenever we look at kind of a urban planning or community scale level for sustainable solutions to the climate crisis and the ways that it impacts local communities, we also can look at other sustainable solutions like increased regulation for new urban and suburban developments. And that's kind of like Dr. Banner was talking about with incorporating more sustainable developments as opposed to urban cover, like he talked about, that is exacerbating the climate crisis. As while those are the norm, increased regulation in a more sustainable direction could help drive builders and city planners in a more sustainable direction. If you live in Texas like I, or anywhere kind of in a very arid, dry climate, you've probably heard the phrase that Texas or another location is running out of water. And what that refers to is whenever increased urban development and population growth is outpacing the amount of water available for an area. So we see this especially with groundwater supplies and aquifers that are starting to dry up too quickly in order to meet the amount of growth that is happening within an area. So by encouraging increased regulation on a more local government level for such urban developments in a more pushing them in a more sustainable direction, we're able to limit the overuse of groundwater and also other resources that are already put at risk by the climate crisis. Cities can also look at new water resource monitoring infrastructure in order to manage and keep track of how the climate crisis is impacting water resources, in order to see how effective current mitigation strategies for the climate crisis are on a local scale, and also in order to make sure that cities are taking steps in order to not exacerbate the climate crisis any further. We see this especially with groundwater monitoring. For example, the Ogallala Aquifer within Texas has been put at stress due to increased water resource demands, and also the impacts that climate change and global warming have on environments. So if we're able to more effectively monitor these water resources, we're able to make sure we're using them in a very responsible fashion. Cities can also look at improving carbon storage and protecting natural buffers within the environments, and how communities are kind of superimposed onto natural environments in order to use the natural environments that are pre-existing in order to limit the effects that climate change can have on a more human-oriented infrastructure. It's also possible to look at other ways to obtain water resources, such as harvesting rainwater or reusing wastewater, and also different desalination techniques that are used even within Texas and other, especially coastal areas. We can see that looking at different water resources, especially in a more renewable way, can help limit the impact that global warming and climate change has on the usage and overuse of water resources. We also, especially within more agricultural areas, we can look at adopting climate smart agriculture, which will allow existing economic systems within, especially, like I said, agricultural communities, in order to continue functioning in a way that is sustainable for their way of life, but also sustainable for the impacts that climate change will continue to have in the future. And by making sure that agriculture and also other economic industries are taking in mind climate change, it's also able to limit the impacts in worsening climate change that such industries can have. So now let's look at the individual efforts that can be made as someone within a local community, as just one person, what you can do specifically to limit the impact that climate change can have on your community, and also raise awareness for the worsening climate crisis that is present within our world. So it can be really easy to feel kind of demotivated and disheartened by the fact that the climate crisis seems to continue to be worsening. And especially as someone who is within either a community that is extremely susceptible to the impacts of the climate crisis, or in a community where there are a lot of factors worsening the climate crisis, it can feel that individual efforts are relatively futile. But there are things that can be done in order to take action as just one person. For example, individuals can get involved in climate change activism and educational campaigns. And congratulations, you're already doing that by watching this webinar now. Because just by being educated on the impacts that climate change can have in your own local community and also on a more global level, you're able to better recognize the impacts that climate change has and help encourage others to take action towards the goals that are relating to mitigating climate change. So by becoming aware and educated on the impact of climate change, it's able to kind of make one person's impact a more kind of community awareness of it by kind of encouraging others to adopt similar views through educational campaigns as well. You can also take action within your community to encourage sustainable practices at a local level. For example, relating to the water resources, if you were to join a water board within your community, you can often have a direct influence on the ways that water resources are managed and used, as well as different urban planning elements, in order to encourage your local community to take up more sustainable practices that are better able to limit the impacts of climate change. You can also remain informed on local water conservation guidelines in order to make sure that your individual impact on the worsening situation of groundwater resources and other water resources in relation to climate change is as minimized as possible. Some other things that individuals can do is support causes that are attempting to address the impact that climate change has on water resources and on society on a more kind of a larger level. Such examples can be through donations, volunteering, and various other efforts just to support these causes and efforts and campaigns. Lastly, you can also consider getting involved with climate change and sustainability research. And this is especially directed towards young people who might be considering careers in the future or starting kind of their secondary education or their work life. Because by seeing the importance of climate change awareness and climate change activism within the local community and also on a more global level, and choosing to kind of create your own place in society that emphasizes the importance of this cause in societal awareness and in humanity's awareness, you can show that individual efforts are able to contribute to kind of a global awareness of the importance that climate change has within the issues that we're trying to address as we look into the future. As we're looking at individual impacts, it's also important, I think the most important way to kind of get involved within your community as a first step is in order to remain educated, like I talked about with that first point. And I think a great way to do this is to look at data relating to climate change and its impacts in your local community. And a great way to do this is through interactive maps. So we'll look at two examples. One is specifically related for Texas, related to the conditions within Texas, but one is more generalized to the United States with the details in various states. But if you look online, there's a lot of resources in other countries and other regions that show similar data that are very readily accessible in order to better educate yourself on the ways that climate change is impacting water resources and other environmental aspects within your local community. So the first example that we'll look at is the Texas Drought Monitor, which if we look at, it sorts drought data by county and shows areas that are particularly impacted or susceptible to drought. And by looking at the trends that you see over time, as the data for this map is very frequently updated, by looking at these trends over time, you're able to kind of see the ways that climate change is continuing to impact your community, and also find ways that you might not be aware of that you can take action and raise awareness for your local community. For example, if you see that you live in a community that is extremely susceptible or impacted by drought, you can help, you might find that it is very pertinent and important for you to take action within your community, kind of providing a motivational factor as well. We can also look at an interactive map called the Climate Vulnerability Index, and this provides data sorting different areas within the United States on their level of vulnerability to climate change. So if you are able to kind of find your area in this, or find areas that you are have an influence in, if you see that they are maybe not as vulnerable or even more vulnerable to climate change. You're able to better educate yourself on what steps you can take and how important those steps are going to be to the overall goal of reducing the impact that climate change has on water resources, local communities, and the environments within those communities, as well as the populations, both human and kind of ecosystem wise, have kind of the impact that climate change has on those populations as well. So I'd like you to take a moment, and after we've looked at the different ways that both individuals and communities are able to get involved with climate change activism and mitigating the climate crisis with regards to water resources and other factors, I'd like you to take a moment to reflect just a couple of seconds on the same question that we looked at the beginning, and take note of whether or not your belief has changed or adapted, or if you've remained steadfast in your beliefs. Do you think that one person can make a difference when it comes to addressing climate change and its impact? Okay, so I hope you've taken just a moment to kind of reflect on your answer. And I'd like to take this time to kind of share my own personal belief with regards to this question. And I personally believe that one person can make a difference when it comes to addressing climate change and its varying impacts. Because when we look at the ways that climate change is impacting local communities, often like activism isn't going to have as great of an impact if it's not on a community level. But a community is made up of individuals, and if one individual is able to raise awareness and motivate other individuals, you've created a community that cares about the environment and cares about limiting the impacts of climate change, pushing your community into a more sustainable future. So I'd like to take this moment, since this isn't a live recording or anything, this will be a kind of a period to encourage you to drop some questions within the comments on this YouTube video, and I will do my best to provide answers to the best of my ability. And even if you don't have any specific questions right now, it's important to continue kind of thinking about the things that you've learned in today's webinar in order to kind of recognize them within your community, within your life, and think about ways that you can act on the impacts of climate change within your community. So before we end off today, I would like to thank everyone who has tuned into this webinar in order to learn more about the ways that climate change and global warming are impacting both water resources and other elements of society, both in Texas and on a more global level. Before you sign off, I do have a feedback form that you can access by typing in this Google form link or by scanning this QR code here. It should be accessible if you just scan it on a QR code reader on your phone. And this will help kind of inform how effective this webinar was as an educational campaign, and also how effective my presentation was as I go towards informing the successfulness of my Senior Climate Leaders Fellowship project. Thank you all so much for your time and attention to the issues that I feel so passionate about when it comes to climate change and the climate crisis. Just by tuning into this webinar, you're making a difference, and I hope that you continue to feel motivated to take action within your community as we look towards creating a more sustainable future and limiting the impact of climate change to the best of all of our abilities. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a great afternoon.